Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. High intensity training is paramount in the scope of athletic performance. At some point, or every game for that matter, athletes are called on to exhibit high amounts of power, maximal sprints, cuts, jumps, and exhibitions of force. In training, we also have the polarity. We have low-level, low-intensity warm-up drills and exercises, corrective exercises, technical drills, and it's interesting to watch things as athletes move along that polarity, as they move from these lower-level technical movements into maximal expressions of speed. And oftentimes there's a lot of falling off the tracks. There's a disconnect between these lower-level correctives and lower-level elements and then maximal expressions. And at that point, we need to ask ourselves, is there a better way to do this? Are there better constraints to put in the program that help athletes actually improve their technique in high performance, high intensity exercise? Is there a more effective and efficient way to organize this training session in light of high intensity? I'm excited to have our guests, Kyle Dobbs and Matt Domney, on the show today. Kyle is the owner and founder of Compound Performance and has been a guest on this show several times. He has experienced substantial success as a coach and educator and has an extensive biomechanics and human movement background. Matt Domney is the head coach at Compound Performance. He's a competitive powerlifter in the USPA at the 275-pound weight class. And in addition to powerlifting coaching, Matt has years of experience in general population fitness training. On the show today, Kyle and Matt will be talking about their take on building in constraints to really help those high-intensity outputs and high-intensity exercises, and what to make of some of the lower-level biomechanics and, I have air quotes here, corrective exercise options out there. We'll also be talking today about variability within heavy strength training methods. We'll be looking at the balance of high outputs in sport play versus high outputs in the gym. Kyle and Matt will be giving their take on movement screens, warm-ups, and more. This was a really fun conversation. Had a blast talking to these guys, and I know you'll enjoy this show. Let's get to episode 333 with Kyle Dobbs and Matt Domney. Yeah, it is. This is something that intrigues me just because I think that, powerlifting too can be because it's such a singular element, like training element relative to, I guess, just training for sport. I think the AI type system where it's like very spreadsheet dominant or oriented, it seems to me like that would be a lot more effective. It's more of a linear venture. It's more of a singular goal. So it's never purely linear, of course, but like, it seems like a more linear system could be more effective there versus creating the ultimate, program for a soccer player, the weightlifting program where there's inherently a lot more variability and complex factors. So it's just interesting to think like the only AIs that I'm aware of in training are powerlifting AI type. There hasn't been anything else yet. And so it seems to me that that's probably the reason why.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. It's just a significantly easier way to kind of organize stress in a way that allows people to recover and perform. If we're looking at eventually building out an AI coaching model for sports, for like actual sports, it's going to be extremely difficult to try to figure out how to load manage that while managing everybody else's different positions, individual play times, and all sorts of other recovery factors that you have to look at with an actual court athlete or a field athlete, as opposed to somebody who just does the accessories for real sports.
Yeah, I shouldn't even say basketball. Even like, let's just say sprinting and track, 100-meter dash, because even 100 meters is more, it's almost like there's, I don't know, it's not maybe exponential, maybe gradations on a bell curve. Like, I think even when you go from the squat to the 100 meters, you took a big jump in degrees of freedom and variability already, to the point that, and even the potential strategies, the further out you get, the more distance you get into, track running or whatever, the more strategies could get utilized too. So to me, it's interesting too, because I look at, well, how do we, there is training. It's almost like if you're a strength coach with team sports, in many ways, you are a stress manager. And part of that stress management is the natural variability in your lifting. And you actually don't want to, like, you could train your athletes like a power lifter, but then they don't get variability, and that's probably not going to work out as well for their highest, needs. And so to me, it's interesting to think about, well, this is where lifting is where this all came from. And how do we look at it on the different ends of the spectrum with how does a power lifter train with variability versus what are you looking for in the gym? And I think that's, from my understanding, the trend is for athletic performance has been moving away from like, more 5-3-1 to like more of a in the middle, like easy strength or 1x20-ish, that kind of vibe for sports where they need more built-in variability for the not sport portion.
Which is great. And I think it's where it's going to need to end up going, because there needs to be a clear differentiation between the two. Obviously, there's still going to be points like Kyle was talking about when you're assessing an individual's rate limiters and everything like that, where max strength or motor neuron recruitment or late rate of force development, where these specified qualities are going to be important to coach and important to train if you have somebody who is limited in those capacities. But as a whole, it doesn't need to be SBD and squat powerlifting specific style program. It's just not going to give them the same return on investment.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's even where, for if I do have somebody who is a soccer player, is a basketball player, like any field sport, court sport athlete, and their strength or just force production, we'll say, is the rate limiter. That is what's holding them back. Again, like the exercises I choose there might look like SBD purely because those are probably the most efficient ways to create the most force production, right? And to kind of elicit that kind of stressor for that intended response, right? I'm probably going to do a lot of bilateral sagittal lifts if I want to create the most force, if that's the neurological output that I want to create. Not so much because I want to increase the skill of a squat, deadlift, or bench, but more so just because I want to train that quality at a really high level, right? So I'm probably going to be doing things like, and again, even then, like I'm probably going to use a trap bar instead of a barbell just because it is more efficient. And again, it's like most, quote unquote, most people can lift more with a trap bar. Well, duh. So for that point, like I don't need to do a barbell for a basketball player. I'll probably use a trap bar because I want them to be able to lift the most amount of weight, the most amount of times from that perspective. And same thing, like I might choose a different squat variation. Again, based on, squat for me is usually a little bit more based on morphology and the people that I'm working with and just how long their limbs are. If I'm working with a 6'7" to 6'9" basketball player, like there might be different variations of the squat that are more efficient for that individual than if I'm working with a 5'9" person, just for limb length purposes. But yeah, I'm just going to pick those exercises because that's the response that I can kind of generate with those exercises. It's way more efficient than trying to do something that's like unilateral alternating reciprocal,
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, right? Like I can't create a lot of force there, but that's also not the intent of those exercises. It's just two different tools for two different purposes.
Yeah. What's SBD again before you? So I should ask
squat, bench, and deadlift.
Oh, yeah, I should know that.
Yeah. But to kind of echo the point that, or like to build off of the point that Kyle was talking about there with specifically like a trap bar deadlift, and Joel, your point about degrees of freedom and movement, that's an area where I think trap bar deadlifts for athletes is going to be just significantly better than any other variation of a deadlift, because what I can look at with that is you can perform each rep slightly differently and just work on completing the task, right? So if you want to give somebody a little bit more degrees of freedom, doing a trap bar deadlift and not really caring if it's more hingy or more squatty or more of a hybrid movement in between each one is going to be a significantly more useful variation of a way that you can continuously drive output with a person and allow them to push that more without having to worry about the secondary and tertiary implications of that, right? Where if I'm looking at that as the power lifter, I would be then looking at that like, oh shit, well, sorry if I'm not allowed to swear, this person did 2 sets with a hip hinge and then 3 sets with more of a knee bend. So it's like, okay, now I have to then qualify those first two sets as hip extension and hamstring volume, and those last 3 sets as quad dominant volume. So now I have to like work on load managing their secondary squat later down in the week or their primary squat later down in the week because they've hit a little bit harder quad volume today than I would have liked them to, as opposed to if I give them a barbell deadlift, then I always know this is going to be more of a hamstring, glute, or hip dominant movement if it's conventional, and more of a quad adductor movement and erector movement if it's sumo. So I can predict training volume significantly easier with the use of specific implements like barbells as opposed to trap bars where you can move and you can adjust as you're going.
Well, and even to back that up, like when I was working with Matt as a coach 3 years ago or so, we were doing a lot of AMRAPs, for trap bar deadlift. And like, I got to a point where, I mean, I think I was hitting well over like 10,000 pounds in a set of total volume. Like did 455 for like 28 reps at one point. And, people would comment on my post. It's like, oh, but like as you were doing it, you were bending your knees too much. And it's like, well, yeah, like my hamstrings, glutes, and like erectors got smoked about halfway through that. And I started using more quads.
Yeah. But I wasn't done training. Yeah.
Yeah. But the point of the exercise wasn't to isolate my hamstrings. I'll do an RDL for that. Like if that's what I want to do, it was to complete the most amount of reps at that weight on a trap bar. Right. So again, task completion is very different than trying to identify a specific way to complete a task. And I think that's where, like, I got tons of variability in that, where you look over the course of all those reps, I integrated just about everything. As things fatigued, as things occluded, I just brought in more muscle groups until I got to the point where I was at full failure.
Yeah.
You know, from a task perspective. And I think it's just identifying, like, what are you trying to train? Are you trying to train how many times you can complete this task? Or are you trying to train the hamstrings specifically? Right. And those are two different exercise selections at that point.
I'll have to go back and find that video and put it in the show notes. I was going to say,
it's on Instagram somewhere. It was
way deep. It's deep.
Well, yeah, I would have to.
It's probably deep.
You're trying to find a video. It's like, oh, I know this video was 3 years ago. You're just sitting there scrolling forever.
It's there. It was. Yeah, I do remember it was a rough day the next day.
It's interesting. Like, I think in the scope of track and field training too, but like this is built in team sports is the motor learning based fatigue. And like if you're a track runner, like a 200 meter runner, you run a 300 and you get a little bit, the last 100 of that, you're having fatigue induced changes to your running technique. But those aren't in track. And I don't know how this fits with powerlifting, but I know in track, those are usually not bad unless it just looks like total shit. Like then, but usually it's like you see an athlete trying to hold it together. They haven't totally lost it. There's a little bit of subtle like fatigue, but they're managing it. And I think that's really valuable with the degrees of freedom that exist in sprinting. Now, if I had that sprinter run at 800, that second 400 is probably going to be unvaluable level of degrees of freedom because it's going to look terrible. But there's that sweet spot that I think is really beneficial. But in team sport, especially like the intermittent ones like soccer and basketball, where like you run up and down, you have to jump a bunch of times under fatigue. I personally think that is extremely valuable. Like, I don't see how that could be a negative, really, for the most part. And I say that coming from being like a high jump coach, getting basketball players who the less basketball they played, the worse they got, like that kind of thing. So it's like, clearly that is good. And that's also makes me think about like a 1x20 system. Like, why? Like 1x20, like there has to be that in a 1x20 set too. Like what you're saying with the hex bar deadlift, like that of course exists. And but you'll talk to like Kieran and Flat and Jake Jensen. They're talking about Jeff Moyer, talking about the good successes you have when you have an athlete who is explosive in their sport and then goes and does 1x20. They can ride that for a really long time. But the question is just, when do they need that more the pure output motor recruitment to also? At what point is that necessary to bring in the bilateral, the SBD? I got it now. When is that necessary to bring that in?
I mean, the way that I would look at that is I would just look at the velocity demands of the particular movements and the particular sports that person is going under, right? So if I'm looking at somebody who is training basketball or is like playing basketball or playing soccer or doing something like this, I know that having them grind through a heavy single is probably never going to ever be something that's going to ever be specific enough for them or have any kind of specific neurological carryover for them to actually perform better on a field, right? Because if we're looking at this and we're training just like based off of just the force velocity curve in general, as we start getting to maximum strength, it's just everything is slow, right? So I don't need to necessarily train that specific quality with any of those people. So using things like that and using things like conjugate style banded training or things like that, where they're getting a little bit more explosive and they're looking at producing like increasing their late stage rate of force development and pushing really hard into a movement, like an ascending load as they're going, ends up being a little bit more valuable as long as the goal of the movement is not to actively slow down while you're training. With somebody like that, I would like each rep of a triple to look the same speed. Whereas with a power lifter, I'm actually looking for a decent amount of velocity drop off to see how they're performing and see what they can kind of grind through.
Yeah. Grind tolerance. Yeah. It's
exactly.
Interesting to think about it that way. I feel like too, for sports, like I would be curious of this, like the GPS and sports science world probably has a lot to offer here, but like a sports that maybe have innately like faster accelerations, more of them, like American, like if you're the running back or a receiver in American football, I would imagine that maybe, I'm not 100% sure, but your just pure neurological output is higher than maybe someone who plays soccer, who runs more and he sprints. I don't know. I mean, it's all explosive, right? But maybe the football player could even do better with a 1x14 or 20. I always like 14s. I'm like 20s is just like, I mean,
20s are rough.
20's a lot. But part of me wonders, would maybe like kind of like what you were saying, if someone needs more force, maybe it's the soccer or the basketball player who maybe needs a little bit more of that. Yeah, hex step, but also still has some more degrees of variability than a straight bar, like you said, Matt. But part of me wonders if that could almost be more to something to look at. Like you look at player load as per GPS, how much acceleration, what's the rate, what's the, that, and then maybe that could be an insight into how much of the SBD maybe they ideally need. But I don't know. It's just kind of thoughts kicking around.
Like we work with a friend of ours who runs a gym in New Jersey, Pasquale, Pursue Performance, shout out, who works with a lot of like quite a few collegiate and MLS soccer players. And that's something that, he and I talk about all the time. We talk weekly on programming, and like these guys and girls, they can run forever. Like they've got capacity to spare, right? But they're traditionally not very strong, right? So force production, acceleration, things like that, even decelerating and cutting at fast speeds ends up being the rate limiter for a lot of these athletes. And that's a lot of what he trains. A lot of it is like bilateral lifts and then like intensive plyometrics and things that challenge force production and stiffness. Because they're doing extensives all day. These athletes will run 3 to 5 miles a match sometimes, over the course of a singular match or practice. So it's like they get a ton of contact points, but they're very low level throughout the course of their practice and their sport. But they don't get very many like max effort jumps to hone that ability through their sport, right? And so he ends up training that a lot because that's the biggest area of opportunity for a lot of those athletes to get better, is increasing like neurological systems and efficiency from that perspective. So he'll do trap bar, he'll do like box squats for concentric force, from it, like with an SSB or something of that nature. He'll do like heavy sled pushes for good concentric strength, because a lot of what they do is already so just extensive and almost eccentric in nature that they just don't get the power production of the force outputs in their actual sport. But when they do need it, they don't have it for those little circumstances. I think we talked about basketball on a prior call. It's like kind of similar. Like how many max effort jumps does an athlete actually take in the course of a basketball game? Like true max effort, like not that many. A lot of it is like submaximal, like rebounds, repeat hops, things of that nature. Like unless they're on a fast break and they have the time to actually gather themselves, like there's not a ton of like max effort jumping there either, which is kind of counterintuitive to what a lot of people I think also believe.
Yeah, I think the way I played basketball, in hindsight, just for me, and then even talked a little bit with I was talking with Dan Nabov a little bit about different players who have different profiles in the NBA, and I think I played basketball not efficiently is a good way to put it. I sprinted and jumped hard, and I think actually that allowed me to not need to go as heavy. Just intuitively, I did really well when I was playing basketball and just doing like a set of 10 barbell step ups, something simple. Because I played so damn hard. But I think now if I played old man basketball, I probably would need more. I find that actually I do need more neurologically stimulating stuff outside of sports sometimes. So it's interesting to think about, like, sport. And the more sport data tells us at some point, like sporting load, how intense. And, I think it's interesting too, like with powerlifting, it's just a given it's going to be intense. It's going to be extremely neurologically intense. And kind of finding, well, if you're an athlete, you should have one thing that is extremely neurologically intense, but everything outside of that, it's like it's increasing shades of variability in many ways. Just kind of looking at it from that perspective. You guys too. I wanted to ask you. I think it was David Gray who was mentioning this, like corrective exercise. People don't train hard enough, but then of course you can take that spectrum all the way to I don't know. Let's run like a marathon, some extra marathons in the week, and do the do the CrossFit chippers and do Metcons every day or whatever. There's always the balance. So I'm curious what you guys' take is on, I guess, like with the influx of more corrective, more movement oriented things. How do you balance that? How do you make sure an athlete is appropriately getting the stimulation they need to adapt with, and then but yet still looking at movement quality, seeing if there's things from that, I don't know, corrective is a good word, but movement quality perspective. How do you balance hard work and movement quality?
Do you want to take this first, Kyle, or do you want to go for it?
I'll talk about it from because I think my answer is going to be a little shorter than yours. Also, probably is. I think again the quote unquote corrective exercise. I think there's also a big issue with just the name itself. What it implies, but I also think it's purposely ambiguous from an industry perspective because I made a tweet about corrective exercise last week and had multiple people messaging me about like, well, what's corrective exercise, and it's like, I honestly don't have a good answer for that. It's like if you imagine, a rehabilitation exercise or something you would give to somebody coming off an injury, like that's probably what we're going to classify as like corrective exercise, right? Like it's going to be something that's a very low level stimulus because that person is coming from a deconditioned or detrained position. And I think my issue with a lot of the corrective exercise, to use that term that we see in the industry, is we're using it on people who aren't injured. Like we're using it as like an actual exercise, and typically it's like if this individual has kind of reoccurring chronic issues or whatever, but they're happening like under extreme fatigue or under extreme intensity. Well, that's not like a biomechanical issue, or that's not necessarily a mechanism issue as much as it's like that's a training or capacity issue, right? Like that's poor load management. And that might be something where it's like, we just need to program better, or we just need to get this person stronger relative to that task. Now, the people who are going to argue with, Matt and I or somebody, or even David saying that online are saying, oh, but I don't want my runner to train like a power lifter. When it's like, no, we don't either. That's not,
never said that.
Yeah, that's a false narrative. Like that's not what we said either, right? We said they need to get stronger, but that's within the context of their sport, right? And their activity. That's not, they need to go have a 2,000 pound total, right? These are two very different things. So I think, again, most issues that we typically see, and in my experience of, 15 plus years working with both gen populations and athletic populations is, most people, when we start talking about like the need of corrective exercise, they're really just not very strong. And like strength is the rate limiter. Even a lot of the stability issues, unless somebody has a neurological disease, a lot of the stability issues I see are people who are just not very strong in relation to managing themselves in space. Right. And I think that's where like a lot of that's just exposures. Can we just get them better at the things they're doing? Voila, they get stronger and the disability kind of corrects themselves. And we don't have to spend a lot of time doing things like active mobility and activation drills, and sometimes even like the respiration stuff, which again, not saying those things can't be useful in the right context, but that doesn't mean they're useful in every context. And I think that's where the industry kind of starts getting these things backwards, is they see somebody come in and they're like, oh, I see your assessment score. We need to get to the ground and do these things, do this algorithm before we ever get you into the strength training process or the progressive overload process or whatever. And that's what I see. Maybe that was longer than I expected. But
the insights were hitting you as you went along. So
yeah, but that exact thought process and that exact way of thinking has influenced and infiltrated powerlifting as well, where it makes even less sense for these people to have to do a lot of these low level activities and a lot of these things than somebody who is completely deconditioned or somebody who is post severe surgery and like long layoff, right? Like if I have somebody who benches 315, which in powerlifting is not even an impressive bench anymore, and they hurt themselves even females. There's a Jen Thompson is a 148 pound female that benches 325. Like it's like completely tested. Like she's just very strong. But looking at that, like those people who are doing anything and moving any kind of load, the minute we remove load from them, they're going to just organize into a completely different position as soon as they're loaded again. So what I think corrective exercise needs to move to in powerlifting is finding the whole point of corrective exercises in rehab or rehabbing things is to find an appropriate entry point to allow somebody to still train and progress while working and dealing with something, right? So if we're looking at this in powerlifting, that could be reducing the range of motion of a given movement, like a squat or a bench. That could be reducing the range of motion of a deadlift and having them do block pulls or rack pulls. That could be reducing it a little bit more and having them do RDLs from a very specific range of motion, like just to above the knee. that'll still allow them to load whatever they're loading in a way that they will continue to get some stimulus and actually train out of it, right? Where if I'm looking at somebody, like my perfect example for me is like myself. I tore my pec twice this year benching, right? I had it once in March and then once again in June. And I got my pec better. I didn't do push-ups. I started off with push-ups because that was about all I could tolerate at that point. That was my entry point there. But after push-ups were done, I just started benching again. And it's like my corrective exercise was benching through a full range of motion with progressively increased loads week to week to week until the point where I'm now hitting bench PRs again. So it's one of those things that I think a lot of people misunderstand, because the stuff that we do, or the stuff that you will actually have to do to get to a point, is not flashy. It doesn't look good. You can't market it on social media, but it's the stuff that's actually going to work and give you the ability to do something for a longer period of time. One of the things that I see consistently with people who do a tremendous amount of correctives and do a tremendous amount of stuff in powerlifting, particularly that are very, very non-specific, is when they get back to, they always talk about how they're feeling really, really, really good and their joints feel great and their body feels amazing. And it's because they're completely and totally unloaded. And as soon as we get back to any sort of actual training again, number one, either the issues completely and totally flare up again, or they've dropped so many kilos off of their best lifts that we would have to extend a prep out another 10 weeks to be able to give them a chance at hitting what they've done previously, right? Because there's that whole reintroduction phase where we have to adapt to some sort of a stimulus again. We have to start training the nervous system again because they just haven't been lifting heavy or haven't been doing anything specific enough to train the skill of the particular movement, or train the actual, or train anything to like with output or with any close to proximity to failure. So it just becomes one of those things where the more and more I see people do it, the more and more I kind of realize like it's just not the best way that I can spend somebody's time in coaching. The best way that I can spend somebody's time is if I need to take a little bit of time off of something, remove it for a week or two, and then find an entry point that's going to be slow and easy to get them back into, but allow them to progressively overload it week to week. Because if we can't progressively overload it week to week and they're doing the same thing over and over again, the carryover is just not going to be there. Like a great example that I could go into without like naming anything super specific is a lot of the ground based like hip resets or like pelvis reset drills for somebody who squats even 300 pounds, right? Like if you're a 200-pound man who squats over 315 and you're laying on your back trying to reset your pelvis into position, and you stand up and you load 315 on your back, well, you now have something heavier than your body weight on your back, which is going to mess with your center of mass management to begin with, because it's on your back. So it's going to push your rib cage forward in space. You're going to be in a slight hinge. So now your center of mass is over your foot, is like your body weight is pressed over your midfoot, but the bar is actually your center of mass now. So that whole thing that you just did to try and reset your pelvis and everything like that, where you're trying to move your rib cage back and get your center of mass over your pelvis, has now just been replaced with a barbell. And now as soon as we get into that position, all that I see these people doing is trying to replicate the same movement and just flexing their lower back the entire time, because it's not even a neutral spine anymore. And it's making squats look worse. The load is going down, and they're just looking at it and going, well, my back didn't move. And it's like, yeah, but it was also 170 pounds as opposed to 315 that you normally squat. So like, who cares? It's not specific at all to the sport.
We needed that t-shirt. There's no stacks in the jungle.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's because that is something like I remember seeing probably over a year ago at this point, but somebody who was working with a super high level, like 800-pound plus squat. And the gentleman apparently had a hip shift. It was
a 1,200-pound single ply squat.
Okay. So the gentleman had a hip shift that he was trying to correct. And in the post was a body weight squat with a Dow talking about how they fixed this person's hip shift. And it's like, you didn't fix this person's hip shift. You took the load away from this person. Yeah. Those are two very different things. Like, put load on his back and let's see what's happening here. And, that's one of those things. Like, if I'm in the situation where I'm working with a strength athlete and we're trying to correct a hip shift or something of that nature, right? Like, I can do one of two things. I can take the load away and have them practice on technique that at a much lower load profile, which may or may not, probably not, in my opinion and experience, actually help them when they get to increased loads. Or I can do something like put them on a highly constrained hack squat with a substantial amount of load and let them, where they can't really shift their hips, and let them work through pushing load bilaterally through like an even, relationship between both legs, right? Like there are things that I can do while keeping the stimulus high to mitigate someone's ability to shift their hips, right? I could do a box squat. I could do a Hatfield squat. I could do a hack squat. There's a lot of things, a lot of variations that I could possibly utilize to minimize that hip shift while not completely deloading that individual, still maintaining 60 to 70% RP, like 1 RM potentially, right? So I can actually build capacity within trainable volumes and trainable intensities. And I think that goes a lot farther from that perspective.
It's one of the reasons why I brought up pin squats as one of my favorite corrective exercises for squats. We're just going to reduce the range of motion to an area where you can either tolerate the load through pain with the pain tolerance threshold number. So like 6 out of 10 is your pain tolerance threshold. We're going to just keep you under that 6 out of 10 and get you putting as much load as we can at that range of motion. Or we're using that as a way, if we have a hip shift that we deem necessary to correct, because I don't deem all of them necessary to correct, I'm just going to cut you at a spot where you don't shift. And you're just going to do pin squats into that area. So you can also learn how to then reorganize your body into load after it's come to a complete stop, right? So there's no elastic component. There's no stretch reflex. There's nothing like that they're doing out of this. They're coming to a complete and total stop and then pushing up into the load again, right? So if we're looking at something like this, that's where a pin squat can be super useful, because I can just progressively lower those pins and then eventually take them away without taking any load off of that person. In fact, I might actually increase their load because they're continuing to train something.
Well, that's the beauty of like a Hatfield, is you can overload the eccentric.
Yeah.
Quickly, I wanted to let you know about the chance to try out Performance Herbalism for only a few dollars shipping costs and get one of Lost Empire Herb's flagship products, Pine Pollen, for free. Switching to an herbal emphasis in my supplementation has been a life-changing switch for me. Just as nature is by design balanced and sustainable, I believe that the more natural our diet and our supplementation is, the better. I love and use several Lost Empire Herbs products that boost not only my energy, but also my strength. These include Shilajit resin and the Phoenix formula. You can check those out by heading to lostempireherbs.com/justfly and grab 15% off. If you're on the fence about the power of herbalism, I have a great offer for you, which is that you can get free Pine Pollen. Pine Pollen is an herbal powerhouse that is a hormonal and energy booster packed with nutrition. It's actually part of the Phoenix formula. And you can get that for free along with the normal shipping fee at justflypinepollen.com. All right, let's get back to the show. I was just thinking with the pin squats, that is very similar to Dan John has talked about when he was injured, like just loaded carries. It's very similar. It's like you're dropping very little. And although with the pin squat, it's more intensity, the loaded carries, it's more like just fatigue and reciprocal motion. And still some level of intensity, but it's not quite the same. But
you're stressing the system.
But it's still stressful. Yeah, it's still hard. It's not like, hey, I'm going to carry like 30-pound dumbbells around. It's like, no, I'm going to drag a heavy sled and carry 110-pound dumbbells for X amount of distance. And it's the key is that it's hard. And it reminds me a little bit of like what Tommy John has said on the show. He's like, if you're hurt, the solution or your training should actually be a greater stimulus than the thing that hurt you. And that's so...
I've
with
all,
that's
that
a little
so many times from him, and that's where I got it from. And it's just like, if not even with injuries, right? Just if you're using a compensatory strategy that you don't want, right? Like if you're self-organizing in a way that you don't actually deem as being beneficial long term, like if we want to put it that way. I don't want to talk about an injury risk or anything like that, but if it's just something that you don't want to happen, well, in order to get out of that and to stop self-organizing into that, like you have to train where you want to be at a higher stimulus than whatever's eliciting that response, right? There's no other way.
Give the nervous system a reason to select that pattern as your primary way of executing a task.
You have to train that as the primary, route, right? And I think that's like the primary pathway from a movement perspective, and I think that's completely missed by the entire, kind of quote unquote corrective exercise movement that we've had. I mean, really over, the last decade plus at this point, we just have new systems to kind of work off of. But this started with FMS and NASM, way back in the day, is they're all so low level, right? Like we're giving people who squat double body weight or run marathons, right? And have tens of thousands of ground impacts, like drills that involve like bands that not only are really progressible, but they also have a force curve to where there's not even actionable force on the majority of a range of motion or something of that nature. We're doing like body weight activation drills, for low volumes. Like these things they're not going to carry over to the actual task demands. There's no, if you understand how the nervous system works and how it perceives environmental stress, there's no way that these things are going to work within that person's actual task.
Yeah, it's an example that we could go with that is talking about glute activation, where if we're looking at somebody doing a bunch of body weight hip thrusts on the ground or body weight glute bridges on the ground versus a heavy deadlift. So let's say that person deadlifts 500 pounds, right? What do you think the felt load on the hip extension component of a glute bridge would be? 15% body weight? Yeah. So if that person is let's say they're 200 pounds. So let's say, and we'll drop it down to 10% to make it a little bit more even. So we'll put it at 10%. So it's 20 pounds of load per hip thrust versus one 500 pound deadlift. So it's like that person would then have to do one set of 50 to even be close to achieving a similar stimulus that they would from their single rep of deadlifts. And it's not even the same stimulus, right? Because the magnitude is different.
About volume versus intensity, right? So again, like if that person's rate limiter is intensity, those hip thrusts they're not doing anything.
Yep. If they suffer at hip extension at the top of a deadlift, then you need to teach them how to deadlift with better hip extension as opposed to giving them other things that are going to make them feel something and then not have any carryover to the actual movement itself.
Not even talking about the force curve on those two things also being completely opposite one another, where again, the primary focus of or the most load in your hips on a deadlift or an RDL is going to be in the lengthened position, or at least like the mid-range position of that exercise. And your hip thrust or, your glute activation drill is on the fully shortened position with very little actual loading or stress on the lengthened position. Your back's on the ground in the lengthened position, right? So, again, like we look at these things and they just, when you dig a little deeper into a lot of these exercises, they don't make sense based on what we're going to do. They're exercises that'll give people a lot of sensation, which isn't, again, not bad thing, but also not necessarily the thing you want for that type of task, and not necessarily the thing that's going to move you forward with that.
One of the other things that I would look at with this too is if we're looking at the neurological component of a lot of tasks that people think need correcting versus the neurological component that you're getting out of these corrective exercises, there's no carryover between the two of them, right? If we're looking at one of them, one is like a very highly cognitive activity. You have to think about how to actually pose tissue into and make it feel something, versus another one where it's just going to happen as a byproduct of a task that you're looking at completing, right? So one of them is extremely high brain and you have to think about it the entire time. The other one is just going to be something that happens as a result of you trying to do something different. So if we're looking at this, like a perfect example is the same one that I was just going into with the deadlift. Like we have to look at how to coordinate spinal extension, hip extension, and knee extension all at the same time, right? And I'm not going to be able to learn how to coordinate those in any other way unless I'm doing something that's going to overload the system in a way that allows me to practice heavy coordination of my knee extension, hip extension, and spinal extension, right? Like leg pressing ends up being a great accessory movement for deadlifts because it's going to help you with knee and hip extension. You're not going to get full hip extension, but it's going to be a very helpful one to help you learn how to break things off the floor. But if we're looking at a corrective exercise for deadlifting, one of the best ones that I've ever found is just cluster reps. So instead of taking a set of 3, I'm just going to break it down into 3 singles with a 10-second rest in between so you can learn how to coordinate the nervous system a little bit more effectively and allow somebody to just display a high degree of output in that given movement. Because the only way that I can correct something like this with a very high neuromuscular demand is to use something that's going to have that same kind of impact, right? Like Kyle was talking about, the magnitude of stimulus has to exceed what we're doing before because the nervous system has to then receive a reason that, oh, this pattern or this position is better for me to be in than this other one was. And if I can't give them that through exercise selection, then I'm not actually correcting anything. I'm actually, if anything, just adding more junk volume that's not making them better at anything in particular.
Yeah. It's interesting, just the general thought of your ability to adapt to something is how stimulating it is to your nervous system. But you could also think about what are things that make it stimulating. Well, it's competing. Maybe it's even novelty. This is new and I find it interesting, and then maybe, and just all the little nuances. I mean, I always look at it on a level. I mean, just playing basketball or team sport has always been such a important stimulant for me. I don't want to get carried on that thought. I actually had a follow up to something you said, Matt, that I think is worth mentioning, because powerlifting, I feel like is a very different movement than, let's say, like a gen pop person who just wants to be able to go for a jog and not feel pain or feel better, or maybe they want to play pickleball or low level sports or anywhere in between, right? And to me, it seems like powerlifting being the most compressive, to my knowledge, probably the most compressive thing you could do to your body. There's specific adaptations that being a powerlifter carries with it. And it seems like a lot of the corrective stuff is almost things that re-expand what powerlifting compresses, if that makes sense. And so it's like, well, yeah, you do a low level expanding movement and then you go hop back into the super compressive thing. It's just not even going to be
back under a bar.
And then you put 600 pounds on your back again and it's gone.
But what about somebody whose sport or movement choice is not as compressive? Like, what if it's, I don't know, tennis or anything in between, right? Like, so I'm just curious what you guys' take is on more of the corrective movement breakdowns and for athletes who don't have the compressive demand of a powerlifter per se.
Okay, I was going to say, I think it all, for me, like just looking at what people like Dr. Jared Boyd post and a lot of these other like high level physical therapists who work with these people, all of it just comes down to grading the exposure appropriately to giving somebody what they actually need. Like if we've got somebody who's post ACL op, right? I'm not going to not have them do leg extensions to strengthen up their quads because they need to actually learn how to strengthen their quads a little bit more effectively. So all I'm going to be looking at doing with them is picking exercises that are specific enough and like easy enough to grade the exposure on, that gives them an ability to build whatever qualities they're lacking after an injury or in any other capacity, and grade that exposure up in a way that's progressive enough to give them the ability to then choose that as their dominant pattern moving forward, or rebuild whatever needs to be rebuilt.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll also say, because again, I don't think a lot of people know this, but Matt also trained at a box gym for like 8 years with nothing but gen pop people. Yeah. And none of them trained like powerlifters. Yeah. Like he's also,
I don't train any of my in-person people. I still have in-person people.
He's also worked with, all of these people from, things that would be considered much more, kind of quote unquote functional, for normal populations. I think the big thing here is like, if I'm looking at an athlete or a general population client who's looking for more health, and they are coming in that kind of, quote unquote compressed, like very extended positioning, right? Like I will pick exercises that move them back into a more, quote unquote neutral orientation. That doesn't mean I'm never going to do exercises that drive extension though, right? Because I do want them to be able to leverage both of those positions. And being very extended, again, like means two things really. It means one, you're probably not accessing a lot of flexion, but it also means you can't access the action of extension, right? They also can't extend. They're not good at that either, right? From that perspective, because they're already, too close to end range. If we look at this on a continuum, right? So I do want to get them to a more neutral starting point. So I will do things that like front load them and get them in a more neutral ribcage orientation. And maybe I do look at something like a squatty or squat, quote unquote, that gets more vertical pelvis translation and more forward knee translation. But at the same time, even within those exercises, I can still utilize constraints and loads that offer progressive stimulus, right? And I think that's where, kind of circling all the way back to when we were talking about corrective exercise, a couple minutes ago, I'm still strength training. I'm just picking different exercise selections to strength train. I don't even look at those as corrective exercises. That's just better exercise selection.
Yep.
From that perspective, like I'm going to pick the exercise that meets my client's demands, from that perspective, or the rate limiters. And if the ability to, flex, extend, or get neutral is going to be a rate limiter for that person's, performance or health, like they're not able to rotate, or maybe they just have poor aerobic capacity because their diaphragm's always ascended, from that perspective, I'm going to work on getting them into a better position to, optimize those qualities, if you want to use that word. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to progressively add stimulus to those positions over time, right? And that doesn't mean that I might never have that person do a back squat if force production is the goal. It just means I'm going to get them to a position or to a point where they are able to back squat and leverage that compression and that extension, but not live there, for the next week because of it, from that perspective, and I think that's just high specificity sports versus high variability sports, right? Like the irony of the whole movement variability movement, or whatever, over the course of the last few years, and kind of the tribes that preach this thing is they cut out all of extension and compression. So it's not really variability. They're just getting people into flexion and expansion. Like if those are the terminologies we're using, and saying these other two things are bad. Well, that's not variability. That's just, I'm just going to leverage the other end of the spectrum. Right. And one of the things that I've talked about with several people kind of in these groups is, especially because ISA has such a big deal to do with these, when I'm looking at the internet and I'm looking at, exercise selections and corrective interventions and strategies for these practitioners are posting, it's like there's like narrow ISAs don't actually exist. I'd never see anything for a narrow ISA. Everything's geared towards wides. Everything's about expansion. There's nothing about moving people in the other direction and strength training and building in a little bit more compression, retraction, and extension, from that perspective. So again, like I see a huge bias. Like I don't actually see movement variability when I'm looking at these tribes, and what I see a lot posted, I'm seeing just biasing everything toward expansion, with the assumption that that's what everybody needs. But I don't think that's necessarily the case.
It's actually quite a funny thing that you bring up, because when I had originally went through and learned all of the expansion compression stuff, I was still working.
It's still on Matt's timeline, by the way.
Still on my timeline. It exists.
If you dig back 4 years ago, you got 90s and that different drawbacks.
I was real angry about them too. But when I was still working in person with people, I had a guy who was a very, 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 very narrow ISA. And looking at him, at the time that all the things that I had learned were, again, working on completely restoring expansion and all these other things, because I guess that's the majority of people that these people had seen.
That's what we're doing for you. Right. It's just.
But with this particular person, the exercise and the movement that fixed all of his problems within 2 weeks was barbell back squats. He was the only person that did it, because he was just very compressed or very expanded. He was very kind of rounded over. He didn't have the ability to extend his spine, put a bar on his back. It was like, oh, this is really hard to even get in a position. And then within 2 weeks, he was squatting over 200 pounds, and it was just like everything felt better. His shoulders felt better. His knees felt better. His hips felt better, because he had to actually learn how to manipulate his center of mass forward, as opposed to having it continuously always pushed backwards, and then exacerbating that issue again by front loading them and doing all those other things that would push him more into that pattern.
Yeah, and working with swimmers, that was a big thing for me. I was just starting to get into that world. Yeah, about 4 years ago. I guess that's when it really started to get more popular. 4 or 5 years
2018
ago.
to 2019.
Yeah, and I think at first it is like, we need to, and I do believe, if your sport is compressive, then you need to do some re-expansive things to restore, after your compressive experience. But at the same time, I remember that I had these swimmers who were so just straight, long spines that didn't their pelvis didn't tip forward. They'd do a hinge or something, and their back would just round, and they had no ability to I might Kozak to spill the guts forward, and just giving them that cue to do that more compressive thing, really improved their movement quality, just the way they moved. I was like, oh, so there are people who need the other thing here, and not just everybody doing the same thing.
Right. It just, and that's something that, it blows me away. When I look online, because it's like what I see a lot of is the assumption that everybody needs the same thing. And we're just falling right back into the same old trap over and over and over again, where we're not actually objectively thinking about these things. We're not critically assessing people. We're just giving them an algorithm and saying, oh, we need to, gain expansion. We need to be able to protract the scapulas. We need to be able to shorten the pecs a little bit from that perspective, and close the ribs down a little bit, and get, better inhales or whatever. And it's just for some people, that's great. That is probably going to be beneficial, but it's not going to be beneficial for everybody. There's no way it can be, but when I'm looking online, and again, maybe that's just my little, universe, but I see very little of the inverse of that. And
it's, I think an algorithm with just bigger words now.
Yeah. It's just and it gets us right back into the FMSs and everything else that a lot of these people are so siloed against. But conceptually, it's a lot of the same thought processes.
Yeah, which is all movement screens in general. It's one of the reasons why, for my specific population, I just don't use them ever at all once ever. Like I used to use them, and I would use them in addition to getting SPD specific movements. Like I would get hip internal rotation or shoulder internal rotation metrics and then look at them in relation to somebody's squat stance, bar placement, grip on the bar for their like bench press, how they stand and how they approach the bar for deadlifts and how they complete the movement. And then see if any of those numbers that I would get from their internal rotation or external rotation measurements for their shoulders and their hips would actually be something that was even useful to touch.
I wanted to take a quick break from the show to tell you a little bit about our sponsor, simplyfaster.com. Simplyfaster.com is a fantastic coaching resource, not only on the level of their blog and all the information they put out, but also on the level of their online store. With the click of a button, you can see and purchase the technology that is utilized by so many of the world's great coaches. In simplyfaster.com's online store, you can have access to training technology such as blood flow restriction training, timing systems, including the Freelap timing system, bar speed tracking devices, a variety of resistance training machines, such as the K-Box, and also Kaiser training units, which Kaiser training units being strongly recommended by sprint coach Randy Huntington, for example. You'll also get access to motorized sprint training units, such as the 1080 Sprint, force plates, and much more. You can check that all out by heading to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Let's get back to the show. Yeah. I think that it's, speaking of the movement screens, it's interesting. It's like they all work backwards, and not in a good way, in the sense of, I mean, these days for me, like I'll watch someone sprint or jump, and that's the movement screen. Like, and then if I need to break it down, hey, maybe go lie on your back and do a straight leg raise test. You know, like I see this in your sprinting. I suspect this, but I feel like if you just hit someone with this array of arbitrary tests, that's the ultimate recipe for the nocebo, believing all these things are wrong with you. And then, I have to do all these correctives. You got you hooked on it. And I just think it's so interesting. Yeah, that was one of the questions I was going to ask is, where have you guys gone in the realm of the movement screen, terminology? Is it just watching the skill and then deciding, if you need to maybe here or there? Let me know what you guys think about that.
That ends up being exactly what I do. Is I'm going to watch the skill of the actual movement themselves, see how they do it at around 75 to 80% for 3 to 5 reps, which is going to be challenging enough that I might actually start to begin to see some sort of technical breakdown. And then from there, if I see anything that looks potentially counterindicated or like counterindicative of like healthy movement over a longer period of time, that's when I will look into movement screen stuff. But I will say, with the amount of athletes that I have, I've probably had that once in the last 4 years, maybe one time. And like I've worked with a couple hundred powerlifters at this point. I've had one person who maybe needed something, and he was coming back off of a specific injury, who had just had his shoulder surgically repaired. And we were like 6 weeks post-op. So I was looking at something like that because I knew that the numbers were going to be skewed, and I knew that he wasn't going to be able to get something done. But that's literally the only person I've looked at these for in the last year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah. Mine's a little, because and it's kind of counterintuitive, especially, and it might be a little different if I wasn't remote training everybody, right? But because the athletes that I'm working with typically have more variation in their tasks, I actually get a little more specific within the movements that I'm looking at, because there's no way, like, I can watch like a basketball player's game film and get kind of an idea of maybe what some of these things are. But I will look at things like, again, based on whatever my athlete's doing, if they're an endurance runner or a soccer player or a basketball player, or if they're just, somebody wanting to get more muscular or whatever, like I will look at the task demands of those goals and kind of assess people based on those things. And I'll look at kind of movement qualities and bioenergetic qualities that person is going to need for that activity, and assess people on that. Like I had a basketball player a couple of weeks ago, and his assessment was, I had him do a bodyweight squat, and he was 6'9". It was hingy. I expected it to be hingy. That's cool. That leads me into, again, different exercise selections, different constraints, but not necessarily anything floor based. And I had him doing, things like lateral movement and reactive stuff like ice skaters. Like, can you cut, jump, change direction? Can you do some of these things that are going to be involved and probably beneficial for basketball? Had him do a vertical test, and then I just had him do like a basic aptly scratch test just to look to see kind of what his maximal range of motion for internal external rotation from a shoulder perspective was. And that was it. And based off of those things, and I had him run on a treadmill for 2 minutes. And based on those things, that informed me of, some limitations. And then that informed me of better exercise choices. And then, similar to what Matt said at the very beginning of this call, is he does kind of a 2 to 3 week testing phase for a lot of his people. And that's something that I got from him that I now do as well. Well, I'll create kind of an accumulation block for a lot of my people. That's almost a testing phase, just so that I can see how they kind of, again, are able to accommodate and recover from increasing loads and volumes over the course of 3 weeks, and getting feedback, like general subjective feedback from them on exercise selection. And that allows me to then start formulating better, phases or blocks moving into a long-term athletic development program after that. So it's a 3 week phase. They still get workouts. They're plenty fatiguing. In some ways,
probably harder.
In some ways, it's harder than what their actual training the next phase is going to be. But it gives me so much information, and I think that's where, for my money, I'd rather watch somebody exercise to choose better exercise selections than watch them go through a movement screen of some sort, right? Because it just gives me much better information, from that perspective. Like if I see somebody doing an exercise, they film it, they send it to me, and I see something I don't like, I can change the loading scheme. I can change the volume or the intensity or even the variation. I can add constraints if I need to based off that to make it a trainable exercise, right? Whereas if I'm just watching somebody doing an overhead dowel squat, which nobody can do very well, it's a novel movement this person's never done, and it's a movement that's extremely hard and technical to perform anyway. Nobody does good at these things. Like, ironically, some of the most deconditioned people that I've had in the past have done the best at overhead squats because they were hypermobile and had no muscle mass or anything else. And
I had a 6'4", 330-pound man get a perfect 3 on the FMS overhead squat because he was front loaded. He was able to sit back, great ankle mobility, did it really well. And I was like, yeah, no, we're not doing a lot of the things that you should be able to do because you're 330 pounds.
Yeah. And I had a guy once who was just, very thin and a really low FFMI, if we want to call it that, who it's like he could do it but he was hyper lax at every joint. It's like okay, we're still going to be sitting on some machines, building capacity, building up basic strength foundations, even though that you've got, quote unquote, good movement quality. You don't actually have that good of movement quality because you can't control a lot of it. So these are things that I think, my thoughts have changed with a lot over the last decade. Like I used to teach FMS to coaches, for the organization that I worked for. And it's just I've gotten to the point now where it's a lot of these things just, they give us information, but they don't always give us usable or useful information. One
of the biggest things that I've changed my mind on over the last probably year with my populations is the amount of work that actually needs to be done technique wise and movement screen wise when you pick up a new powerlifting client. Because the majority of people that you're going to coach, if you're a powerlifting coach, when they come to you, and again, this is not going to be everybody, but the majority of people are pretty set in their squat, bench, and deadlift stance. They're pretty efficient with how they move. They've been practicing them for quite a while, and they usually know what they're all going to look like. So at that point, any sort of movement screen that I do is not necessarily going to be completely relevant to the way that person is actually training. And the reason why I just want to look at their training videos and see how they move and what shapes they make when they're training and when they're moving through a given task at a heavy enough load is that so I can better load manage throughout the course of the week, right? If I look at somebody who has a fairly hingy squat and they squat over 700 pounds, it's okay, well, that just now qualifies as a hip hinge, and I just need to reduce your hip hinge volume a little bit more throughout the course of the week. Because I'm not going to change this if you have a very low bar and this is just how you squat and this is your strongest squat stance. I'm not going to do something that's going to remove from that. I'm just going to learn how to better load manage and just check those off on a different box or in a different load column than I would if it was a more knee dominant, slightly more upright squat. So I just want to look at what kind of patterns I'm seeing these people use and use that as a way of quantifying load management and prescribing out sets per week and then watching how they react to training over the course of that given month.
Yeah. Last question for you guys is warmups. So, all this being said, I think that corrective stuff, prehab, whatever, kind of goes hand in hand with this long extended warmup. And I remember back when I first started as a full-time strength coach, it's like you go and it's like, oh yeah, here's the movement prep, and everyone else is doing it. And then I kind of get, I get caught up obviously, and we're doing this. And I remember I had a throws coach one year who comes in and the throws. No one wants to be the strength coach for track in universities because a lot of times the track coaches are writing the programs and you don't have any autonomy. And it's like, I mean, for me, it was about 50-50 for those first few years. And I had a throws coach who would come in, like he had no warm up. And I was like, you have to have a warm up. Like, he's like, the first 2 sets are the warm up. And I'm like, I'm going to get in trouble like as a strength coach because you guys don't have a warm up. And it was fine. Like, it was never, ever a problem. I mean, they had come in from throwing too, but even, but then they had like a 30-minute van ride, cooled down. But honestly, they did like 2 or 3 sets of the first exercise, really light, warmed up. That was their warm up, and boom. It was never a problem. That changed my perspective for sure. I was probably about 30, 31 when that happened, I want to say. And yeah, that was definitely a good food for thought for me. Just curious your thoughts on how you guys approach that part of it versus, I guess, if you are trying to put things in, like, Kyle, you've said in the auxiliaries, if we need more movement options, maybe that auxiliary is being a place for it. I'm curious if the warm up is a place for any of that stuff, or if you save that for the back end of the workout, how you're patterning into your main movements of the day, warm up stuff. Just general thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it definitely falls into 2 categories where if I do have some people who they do need to work on things like positioning and they do struggle with some movement qualities and expressing movement qualities, like that's typically where I'll just move their like traditional core work and some of the things I do from that perspective to their warm up. And because what I'm looking at there is it's like, okay, I'm trying to move femurs and, off a stable pelvis. Typically I'm trying to move, again, like humerus and shoulder blades off a stable rib cage. So it's a lot of bracing, active flexion, active extension based work from that perspective. And it also serves the purpose of generally getting them warm, right? And getting them moving prior to whatever activity they're doing. And then I have some people who they move fine and they do really well and they don't necessarily want to do those other things. And I'll do, progressive sprints on like an assault bike. Like one of my favorite protocols that I'll have people do that's super time efficient is a 5x15 sprint with 45-second rest. So again, 5-minute total time where they start at like an RPE 6 or 7 on the first round and progressively increase outputs until they're at pretty close to maximal output on the last round. And after that, people are usually pretty warm and pretty ramped, and they might need to take a couple minute break, but then they're ready to move into whatever they're doing. I also will use it. It's funny. I posted this on Instagram today, but it's in rowing. It's called a 7 pull test, and it's maximal watts on 7 pulls at max damper on a rower. And I'll give people like 3 rounds of that with 2 minutes rest in between. And same thing by the end of that, like people are usually pretty ready to do whatever after that, and I had my guy today who's kind of a freak show. I think he got over 1100 watts on his last round, which is a lot for that test. I've never gotten above like 910, and I was a pretty decent rower. So I'd like to see what Matt could pull. He'd have to weigh down a rower. He'd have to put some major weights on the front end of it. Yeah. But it's a fun little test. It drives some competition. It gets people psychologically stimulated, and it's a ton of output with a pretty constrained movement, right? So it enables people to really express output and kind of get that neurological drive, get some physiological qualities in there as well. So those are 2 things that like I'll do for people who, especially like on my high stim days, if I'm running a concurrent program with somebody, like those 2 things kind of are 2 birds with 1 stone for me, because they will drive some movement from just flexion extension, shoulder flexion extension, knee and hip flexion extension, whatever. But I'll also get like a progressively ramped neurological stimulus to go with it that doesn't necessarily like over fatigue them for whatever outputs they're doing later on in the session.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I use pretty similarly with a lot of my powerlifters and a lot of the clients that I'm working with. I think one of the biggest things that I mostly use is we just use ramp up sets to get them up to a certain point, right? Where we might have some tempo work to ramp them up or anything like that. But if somebody's squatting for like 405, they're not just going to walk in, load 405 and squat it right away. And I think this is one of the weirdest things that a lot of people like seem to think about, like looking at a power lifter or looking at somebody who is like exerting some actual load or like lifting some actual load when they start to train is like, well, you're not even going to warm up. It's like, I just did 10 reps at the bar. I did 5 reps at 135. I did 3 reps at 225. I did a rep at 275, then 315, then 365. And now I'm ready for my working sets at 405. I've done 7 warm-up sets before I even got to whatever working weight that I was going to be doing that day. And if we look at this in terms of like my population specifically, the easiest thing that we can do when people are starting to like feel tight or feel any kind of like negative training response or negative training effects in any of the tissues that they're going to be training that given day is just to make them spend a little bit more time in that area in that specific movement, right? Like nothing's going to loosen your hips up for a squat better than squatting. So just maybe pausing at the bottom a little bit longer, taking a little bit more time and being more intentional on your eccentric and things like that. It becomes a very, very simple way of continuously warming somebody up. But each rep that they end up doing ends up almost being like a quote unquote total body scan to see what areas they should stop or slow down a little bit more in so they can get through that and then work on exerting force, right? Because the thing that I would look at with the power lifter in particular, or somebody, any kind of strength sport athlete, anything that we're looking at doing where we're doing something that's going to downregulate the nervous system is going to be the opposite of the intended goal for that given training session. So something like a 7 pull test is going to be great. Something like 2-minute like intervals on a bike is going to be great. Progressive ramp up sets on like the actual lift that they're doing are going to be fantastic. Any of those movements are going to be a really, really good thing to do because they're going to also train the neurological system to train for output and ramp you up into a way where you can push hard. Whereas a lot of the correctives that people will do as their warm-up set and as their warm-ups in general, neglecting all of the other stuff that's going to start getting them the neurological ramp up that they need, is going to shift them into more of a like a parasympathetic state, which is not going to be conducive to pushing like max output, especially if you have to work up to like a heavy single or something like that. So what I would look at with this is cutting out the stuff that you don't need entirely and replacing it with something that's going to be a slightly more specific, a little bit more intentional, taking it more seriously when you're doing so, and then allowing you to really just ramp it up in a way that makes sense progressively over time.
Yeah, I think that taking serious is actually super important because a lot of the times that I see people doing like the more traditional kind of, again, quote unquote, corrective warm-ups, they're completely going through the motions.
That's why I wanted to list taking it seriously, because a lot of times I'll see people who will like, they'll go to work on bench and they will literally just one rep, and they'll go and they'll be ready to go right away. And it's like, they didn't set up the same. They didn't do any of the other things the same. And like, this is something where I agree when people talk about taking each rep like it's a top set, is because you want the intention to be similar to whatever you're going to be putting your maximum amount of effort into, but you also want your setup and the way you're trying to execute the movement to be as close as you possibly can to it every single time you go to approach the bar or you go to do something with the bar, right? Because, and if we want to look at this, like number one, neurologically, it's going to train you to like be able to express more output in that given position, right? But number two, why would you then go to do a slightly different position movement for something if you're going to change it later on down the line, right? Like if I'm tight in my shoulders and my pecs, I want to arch as high as I possibly can and work on just controlling that bar down so I can loosen up my shoulders and make them feel a little bit better in that specific area where they feel bad. Like that was exactly what I did today. Like I benched this morning and my shoulders felt terrible going into bench. So what I did was I just got myself into as high of an arch as I could. And I gave myself an 8 to 10 second eccentric on my first reps was 155 and then 264. Right. So I just slowed it down as much as I possibly could, paused it for a lot longer than I should have with a little bit of tension, pressed it up, held it for a little bit longer off the chest, and then pressed it up and completed the movement. And within 3 reps, my shoulders were good.
Yeah, I love how your kilo weights represent my pounds weights.
I did not bench 264 kilos. I wish I did.
I think, so for running, similar thing, like I'll typically just do, 2 to 3 rounds of 20 meters of lateral runs, backwards runs, and skips. And then kind of the same thing, go through like an extensive circuit where I'll go through like 3 to 4 to 5 variations of extensive plyometrics. And I vary those up usually session to session. So over the course of a week, I get a lot of different exposures. And then I'm typically ready to go start running. If I'm doing sprints, again, like I'll kind of work my way from tempos into sprints. If I'm doing longer distance stuff, I'll just kind of break right into it. but I can get myself from a lower leg complex and stuff like that kind of warmed up and ready to go in under 10 minutes a lot of the time, and then kind of get to where I'm ready to actually begin my session.
Yeah. One of the things that's been sticking with me ever since I first trained with Paul Cater in Monterey, California, about 9 years ago, I want to say it was the first time we trained together, but the idea of, I mean, for me, I like to give Matt, you talked about like ramping up slowly throughout the session. Like you don't just step in and hit close to your max after 3 sets, which I think a lot of like strength and conditioning programs are kind of notorious for. They do a movement prep, then they do like the heavy squats, and then they ride auxiliaries down like the rest of the time. It's like this super front loaded system. And I like the idea of it like as a song, like when's the crescendo of a song? I don't know, about half to two-thirds of the way through the song is like the peak. So I'm like, all right, well, if we're hitting whatever our heaviest thing is for me, it's kind of there. But everything up to that needs to be like very serious. But I mean, not serious in the sense of like somber, but fully intentional. So I think that's why games have become so popular. And I use those as much as I can when I have the groups to do it. But even when I don't, I'll have, if I have one-on-ones, I just have a dowel rod and I make up all sorts of ways to challenge them with the dowel rod. So I have to dodge it and like different ways, different ways to jump over it and get on the ground and do bear crawls. And so just like, for me, but intensity is the key, because if it wasn't like, it's so easy when it is a corrective to honestly not see the point because you don't feel it. You're like, oh, I think this is doing this thing. I'm not really feeling it. So, but I know I'm supposed to be doing it, and I know it's going to make my training better, isn't it? Yeah. But I mean, it's like, I look at it more, for me, I like the end, like hitting like a hard ISO hold at the end that's relevant to the needs of the athlete is usually pretty good to, I'm like, all right, if we're getting our stuff for that, I think that's helpful. Sometimes though, too, even with running, I've been doing this year more and more, is I'll warm up for running, literally 0 warm up. And then it's funny because the older I get, it's like when I was in my 20s, I warmed up a lot, and now I'm 39, and I'll do this sometimes, is just an ISO hold, like an ISO lunge, and then I'll run like a 150 easy. Then I'll do another ISO lunge and a longer, like maybe the first one's 30 seconds, maybe the second one's 40, and I'll just keep going up till I get to 60 or 70, and I just keep going a little faster. Because everything, like you said with the bench, like it's all your thing. It is the thing. It is intentional. You can't do it. And I know when I was younger too, sometimes I wanted to escape from you find ways to escape from the main skill if you're having trouble with it, like maybe mentally, psychologically, you're not doing as well as you want. I saw this in swimming a lot, as I saw basketball players in the weight room too, or other athletes who, they weren't doing that great in their sport, so they actually would like make it up by going in the gym and grinding it out even harder, which is, the strength coach loves it. That's cool, but like they're also using it as an escape because, but of course, Matt, your example, like that is your sport, of course, but I find that the warm-ups that it's like we want to find, we don't want to, but we unintentionally are escaping the exact thing we need to be training all the time. And
sport guys start doing the accessory Olympics.
That's my people. Yeah. I did that myself.
Everything but the big three.
I did that myself for a little while too. And like my training and my previous prep was a lot more complicated than my prep is now. And that was one of the things that I did, was if I had a bad squat, bench, or deadlift session, I would just try to go, quote unquote, make up the volume on something different. It's like, yeah, I mean, that's cool, but you wanted to bench 450 and you only benched 225 today, and you stopped because your shoulders and elbows hurt. And then you went and got a bunch of dumbbell benches in. It's like, that not really going to help you that much. It's 50%. Like,
yeah, it's so interesting to put that in perspective. It's cool too, to like just the differences we have in our sport, populations, and the kind of, you see the same themes, but you see them in a different way, and it definitely helps to see the whole better. So, but hey, I think that's about all the time I have for the show today. Great talking to you guys. Thank you so much for coming on. I don't know if you guys have any last thoughts or anything to wrap up what we've been chatting on, or if not,
I think we covered a lot.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. My brain's like, awesome. Well, hey, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and good to sit
Thanks
down.
a lot for having us on.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Appreciate it.